Today I'm speaking with Ashley Chiu, EY Canada's Cannabis Strategy Advisor. In this interview, she shares tons of useful insights for investors with a focus on two main topics. First is company valuations. In the second half of the interview, we focus on Cannabis 2.0. We wrap things up with a future of cannabis conversation, looking at what's going to be driving the industry moving forward. Now on to the interview. All right, I'm here with Ashley Chiu from EY. Thanks for coming to the studio, Ashley.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to be talking about the cannabis industry as a whole today, sort of an insight segment, if you will. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff happening right now. But before we dive into all the different aspects, I'd love to just get you to give a bit of an introduction of sort of who you are, what you do with EY, and you know, why you have some knowledge that investors might be interested in.
Sure. So I've been in the space for about 3 years now, and I'm actually EY Canada's Cannabis Strategy Advisor. Originally, I got into this space by working with cannabis companies to help them build out their business processes and help them list on the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ. With that, help with formalizing governance within the organization, as well as helping them select technologies to enable their growth. And now I spend a lot more time on M&A. So strategic M&A between cannabis companies in the industry today, as well as helping adjacent companies enter the space. So these are companies like food and beverage, pharma, CPG. All of these companies are really interested in what's going on in cannabis, and we help them assess the risk and find a partner.
Excellent. Well, so one of the big things that we saw that we've seen coming was the write-down of goodwill and the impairment of assets. What is goodwill? How does it get onto the balance sheet? And how do you have to make the assessment that it needs to be written down?
Sure. I mean, goodwill really is an intangible asset, so it's not like a facility that you can see and touch or capital equipment. It's really a testament to the intangible value that this company has, and whether it's, you know, inherent within the processes or the brands that they have. Typically, goodwill is determined in M&A by, you know, assessing what the tangible asset values are. So again, the facilities, the capital equipment, what is that actually worth? And then you have the actual price that you have, and that difference is goodwill. And so if a company has overpaid for, you know, an asset or an acquisition, then you start to see a lot of goodwill on that balance sheet, and that becomes untenable over time, especially when you look at a company's balance sheet and it's more than 50% goodwill. That can be actually quite frightening, because that's a sign of things to come, potentially, that there might be a big write-down.
Excellent. And so what do you think is a healthy number? Do you guys have something you're like, this is an okay range?
You know, in the cannabis industry, no, because it's everything is so new. So especially
Right.
when you look at Canada, how do you say that a brand is worth $100 million? I'm just not sure, because there just hasn't been that history to support that. And so, you know, from quarter to quarter, from year to year, you do have to, as management, you do have to assess, you know, future earnings, what type of cash flow these assets will generate. And if you know, at the end of the year, if you're just not hitting that target, you will have to make some adjustments. We
were chatting earlier about inventory. I'd love to hear your thoughts, because you see, not just inventory, sorry, but accounts receivable, accounts payable. We saw the Hexo Labs kind of issue pop up. How do you think about it when you're looking at, you know, valuing a company?
Mm-hmm. So I think the components that you mentioned are really important, and they speak to working capital. So working capital comprises of accounts receivable. So how much money are you expecting to come in? Right now, when we look at, you know, who cannabis companies in Canada, who their major customer is, a lot of the time that's the government. You know, government has their own terms, but the risk of default is very low. When we look at inventory, I think that's where cannabis companies have a lot more wiggle room, and, you know, can be a lot more strategic. I can't speak to, you know, how old some of this inventory is, but theoretically, you know, once it's past a certain point, companies could think about starting to extract it, and putting it into derivatives and Cannabis 2.0, which, you know, seems to be a big topic these days. On the other side, there's accounts payable, and I think this is where people should be paying a lot close attention to, because if the AP balance continues to grow and grow, I think that's one of the first signs of distress, because it means that companies are starting to stretch their AP and, you know, maybe not paying on time.
So what are some levers that a company can pull when you're looking at it and saying, you know, are they going to be able to kind of scrape by here?
We've seen a lot of capital for cultivation certainly dry up, even for, you know, cultivation ancillary devices like sensors. I think a lot of the companies that will have access to capital will be doing something that's a little bit different. There's something differentiated about them. Maybe they have intellectual property that they can license or leverage, you know, into international markets and scale that way. Right. I think, you know, gone are the days that you could raise money on a piece of paper. Yeah. And so when we look at alternative financing, I mean, sale leasebacks have been huge, but that's always contingent on, an operational and licensed facility where, an investor will come in and, basically buy out your real estate and will lease that property back to you. And that will open up a significant cash flow.
And is that something that's always available, or does that almost become tapped out as well?
I think for the right facility, for the right operators, that will be available. We have seen less and less, especially in Canada. But that's not to say that there aren't funds willing to do that. And actually, with the distress that we see in the market, there have been a lot more distressed funds that have been popping up that are interested in opportunities like that.
Right.
I will also say that there are other, segments that are interested in the space and lending, primarily in international markets, primarily Europe. There are some PE funds that are also looking at the space. And frankly, banks and institutional investors, they don't want to lend into a company that needs it for working capital to run their business, right? Even if they would take security over your facility, they don't ever want to take possession of that.
No.
So to the extent that that becomes untenable, I think institutions and investors are more willing to, come back to the table and renegotiate to see what those terms are going to be.
What are some of the big signs that, anyone really would look for in terms of like a company being, solid footing?
Yeah, I mean, on solid footing, I think you have a road to profitability. Your assumptions aren't too aggressive. You are, humble and you know where some of your shortcomings are. And I don't think these companies can do it all by themselves and certainly do everything alone. Right. And so a lot of these, adjacent, more mature industries that are looking in want a partner that really is based in reality and can contribute to a meaningful strategic partnership because to my point earlier, I mean, pharma, food and beverage, alcohol, tobacco, they might be looking for different things and certainly their businesses are different. So it's not just about, throwing money into the ring and seeing what happens. Yeah. It's really about, I think now that we've seen this huge correction, it's really about, picking a strategic partner that will get you to the end.
In the long term.
That's exactly right. And, governance is a buzzword that people don't really talk about. But, for Fortune 500 companies, governance is their world. And so they're really sensitive to, negative news or, rumors and things that could hurt their brand eventually. I mean, cannabis, as you know, is very controversial still. Yeah, I think we're so lucky in Canada to have the opportunity to work in this space, but not the rest. The rest of the world doesn't see it like that.
Right.
And so, I mean, it's not even about the money anymore, about the valuations, because for these companies that have billions in the bank, they could easily scoop one of these cannabis companies up, turn it into an R&D endeavor, and put it under a subsidiary that has no ties to the parent company, right? But I think, bigger than that, a bigger hurdle to come over is actually the stigma and, the education that needs to happen and, helping management really see fact from fiction.
What does a good governance structure, what does good management look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think you have to have the policies and procedures in place to help people do the right thing. An easy example is, there's no requirement to have, a whistleblower line to report things that are going on in the company. But even if it's not required, I think it's still a good idea because it shows that management is open and transparent. Having policies and procedures in place. How do people know what their jobs are and what the rules are? How do they know what they're allowed to spend on given their responsibilities and ranks? What are the additional approvals that have to be in place? And frankly, when it comes to financial reporting, how do you know that these numbers are what they say they are?
Right.
How do you know that when you put in an invoice that the number was right? How do you know that the payment went to the right person? And so these little things, I think, are easy to overlook and maybe just are considered, paperwork. But really, that's what proper governance is you say you do something and do you have the the documentation and the evidence trail to back it up. That's exactly right.
And so how from an investor's perspective on the outside, we're really all, if you're just a smaller investor, you can just look at the financial statements and listen to a conference call. Like, are there places that you can go to see this? Is it just you kind of stuck reading on the management or the company's website of like corporate governance and the rah kind of platitudes that they throw up there? Like, what can you really look at specifically to understand that this company is actually operating with really solid governance?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's tough. I think a lot of the time that's tone at the top. You can take a look at the board of directors and see what the composition is. Taking a look at our third third parties, related third parties disclosed? Or is there true independence within the organization? And then, taking a look more at their disclosure, because I think right now, given, all these companies are in different exchanges, there's different requirements, and for the most part, segmented reporting and detailed reporting and disclosure is just not really is just not communicated right now. And so for people who are looking through a sea of, I don't even know how many publicly traded companies there are these days, I think they really do need to pay attention to what these companies are saying in their press releases and what their financials actually say.
All right, so just want to switch gears from the balance sheet to Cannabis 2.0. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on the potential of the market.
Yeah, I think with the slow retail rollout, it's not just retail now. I think a lot of companies haven't amended their licenses, don't have the equipment in place, don't have the manufacturing capability to actually deliver on those products yet. So we'll start to see more growth, I think, going forward. I think the interesting thing about Cannabis 2.0 is there's always the question, well, will it cannibalize 1.0, dried flower and oil? I mean, oil is going away, but I think Cannabis 2.0 is going to really attract the newcomers, the people who maybe aren't as comfortable with smoking, aren't as experienced with terpenes and different genetics, and so for them maybe having a chocolate bar that's 10 milligrams is a lot easier to introduce them into the category. And the interesting thing I think is similar to early days for Cannabis 1.0 is the first couple of months everything is sold out, right? Because of the novelty of it. And so it'll be interesting to see incidents of repurchase, any type of loyalty that will emerge, and whether or not these people actually stay in the industry and actually become part of the cannabis community. Because I think the other thing is people who aren't as familiar with cannabis and don't consume it often sometimes don't always have to pay for their own cannabis either, right? And so talking about the growth of the legal market, I think these factors come into play. The other thing is, as there's a 10 milligram limit for a lot of these products. And so if you have to eat 100 chocolate bars to feel an effect, I mean, illustratively, that's just not something that people want to have to do.
Be really fat people.
Well, the interesting thing as well is all of these products have a lot of sugar in them to mask the taste of the cannabinoids, which could be kind of bitter at the end. And so I'd like to see a bit more product innovation in the space, and I think
that could be a big opportunity for someone who comes in with the IP. You see some companies in the States I think Ripple is one of them that is really at least publicized. I haven't tried it, of just like this water soluble, tasteless that you can put on anything.
Exactly.
So it'll be very interesting to see that roll out. From you talked about bringing in newcomers, but also in cannibalizing the flower market right now. How do you see the potential effects for 2.0 on bringing over the black market? Is that more just talk, or is there real potential there? What is that? What's going to cause that shift?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about 2.0 products is that we historically don't hear a lot of good experiences of chocolates that were consumed in the illicit market because we don't know what's in them, and I've heard a lot more bad stories than good. And so having a product that's reliable and you understand what the dosage is, I think is really helpful. But with respect to bringing people over, again, I think the product formats and the dosage, frankly, might not convert legacy consumers who are more experienced and require that higher dosage. And so I think it's just going to be a very different segment for sure.
From your perspective, what does a winning 2.0 strategy look like?
Well, I think it depends on the company, but it would be great to see a bit more focus. I think there's still the idea that companies want to do everything and be everything to everyone. And so I think the deeper that you could segment your consumer, the more you understand what makes them tick, why they're buying, what they're interested in, and really developing that profile, I think will help companies build their brand, one, because they're actually talking to a market and resonating with them. And then secondly, I mean, that helps you stand out from, a sea of maybe 20 or 30 companies that are all selling the same chocolate, right? Yeah.
Excellent. And so kind of shifting even further down the road than just say the coming quarters, longer term, future of cannabis, there could be really a massive CPG, or there could be kind of like that craft micro cultivator. How do you see the market dividing, say 3-4 years out?
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot more focus on research. I think data is really, really important. And it's not just, operational data, how does this plant grow? But it's really about the scientific data, clinical data that we need really to identify and then leverage that to then make product health claims. And I think that's where the industry is going. I mean, we've all heard anecdotal evidence that cannabis can be efficacious, but we don't have that clinical data to back that. And I think that's what's really going to push the industry forward. And then in the future, I mean, we're talking about cannabis 2.0 now, but what about 3.0? What about 4.0? What does that all look like? I think there will be products eventually, and hopefully we're moving towards that you will be able to make a product health claim and say, this is good for sleep, or this will help you with this, as opposed to, having a trial and error and seeing if it works for you, maybe it doesn't. And as well, I think with this marketplace as it's maturing, I think there will be a rise of craft. I think, there are operators who have experience and have interest in, growing cannabis on a more craft scale. Certainly the provinces are recognizing that, and they are looking to build a portfolio of craft companies to sell their products and distribute throughout their own provinces. And so I think there's going to be more diversity to come. So I think their early stages, what they're more interested in is understanding the landscape. Where is innovation happening? What is the potential of them getting involved? How can they leverage their expertise to help fuel growth in the market? And so I don't know that it's just genetics or just cultivation. I think it goes beyond that as well. If you're talking about like processing technologies, extractions, formulations.
All right, so now kind of wrapping it up, a fun question. Normally I'd ask, a company, what's your favorite catalyst? Or what's the biggest catalyst for a company upcoming? That's obviously not applicable to you. So instead I'll ask, you get to work in the cannabis industry, you see a ton of different companies, you're thinking about long-term strategy. What's your favorite part of being in the industry?
Yeah, I actually really enjoyed taking the tour of the facility. I think you just don't have an appreciation for all of the thought that gets put into building it. Why did you choose this HVAC system? How did we design our facility? Why did we do things the way we did? And it's just nice to see the different nuances. And then, I've been to probably about 30 or almost 40 facilities now. So I start to see the differences and, what people are doing, how they're innovating in different ways, how they're collecting data while they're doing that. And so even just talking to management and hearing their story and hearing about, their strategic vision and where they want to go, I think there's a lot of hope for the industry. I know we talked a lot about doom and gloom today, but I think we emerge better at the end. And let's not forget that demand for cannabis in Canada is actually quite high. Yeah. I think it's just about transitioning, the market to full legalization, and then, we'll see it all grow.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate you coming in, talking today. A ton of insights, and hopefully we can sit down and chat in the future and things have turned around when it's bright and we can talk more about the opportunities.
Great. Thank you very much for having me.